but we're going to start the first panel here on blockchain. I'm going to introduce the moderator for today, and then he will introduce the speakers. So the moderator today is Dr. Sanjay Mittal. He's an accomplished AI technologist, a successful serial entrepreneur, and a seasoned business executive. He's currently the founder and CEO of Predictica, which develops leading-edge products for building automated AI programs, for example, chatbots, with conversational and learning capabilities. He is also an investor and advisor in various companies. He holds a PhD in computer science from the Ohio State University and a BTech in electrical engineering from IIT Kanpur. So with that, I would like to welcome Sanjay. And Sanjay, if you would introduce the speakers.
Welcome to the panel on blockchain. I think we're going to start even though people are still trickling in. So let me start by introducing my fellow panelists. I'm very happy that we have such a great panel that represent, I think, the three legs of the startup ecosystem. We have Pramod Chandrasekhar. He's doing a startup in the blockchain space. Shivani Govil, she works for SAP in AI and blockchain. And we have Nakul Mandan. He's a VC. And let me hand it over to these guys, let them introduce themselves, and then we'll continue from there. So Pramod?
Hi, guys. So I have been doing a lot of consulting, and then in 2015, around 2012, 2015 range, I did some work in cryptography, and that's how I got into blockchains. And right now, what I'm trying to do is look at how to make a blockchain more accessible for both enterprises and other people in a much more easier manner instead of having to learn new languages and things like that. So that's just a quick overview. To you, Shivani.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shivani Govil. I've been in the enterprise software space for over 20 years, and my passion lies in the intersection of technology, business, and user value. I love technology, and so when people sometimes tell me you're like a kid in a candy store when you see new technologies, but it's more about what can you do with those technologies and how you can apply them, and then how you can deliver value. So currently, in my current role, I am building products for my company on using AI and machine learning, and I'm starting to look at blockchain and what are the potential opportunities with blockchain.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nakul. I'm a VC at Lightspeed Venture Partners. We are primarily an early-stage investment platform. We've actually been pretty active in the IIT ecosystem, so lucky to be involved with companies like Nutanix and AppDynamics pretty early on, and this has been a great ecosystem for us. And I've been doing VC for about 9 years in the Bay Area, primarily focused on B2B SaaS startups.
How many people here have invested in some kind of cryptocurrency? Can we get a quick show of hands, those who are willing to? Okay. And how many came to this panel expecting to find the next cryptocurrency to invest in? So you may want to leave the panel at this time because we are not going to talk about cryptocurrency. I want to be very clear. So blockchain, of course, everyone knows about because of all the interest in cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin and so on. But there's a more serious side to it, which is it can actually be applied for all kinds of applications dealing with maybe smart contracts and so on. So in today's panel, we're going to focus primarily on applications, more on the enterprise side, but not talk about cryptocurrency other than the role that cryptocurrency might play incidentally in terms of maintaining the blockchain. So what I'm going to do is ask the panelists to sort of address the specific areas in blockchain with smart contracts and so on that they're focusing on, and I think you'll see an interesting diversity of applications. So let's start with Pramod.
So we think of blockchains as more like a global memory. If you think about a blockchain is really all about immutable data and consensus. And we are looking at it as that works like a interesting memory that can't be tampered with. And most of the use cases we are looking at fit into that paradigm. So the one that I'd like to bring out is we're doing something in healthcare credentialing. So I don't know how many of you know it, but when a doctor moves to a new hospital, it's a nightmare process of credentialing that they have to go through. The hospital has to verify their employment history all the way back from the medical school, and that means they they have to go through this thing where they contact all their previous hospitals, set up calls with the new hospital, and get everybody connected, and that can take 3 weeks to 3 months. What we are looking at is if the hospitals can give an attestation to the doctor when he's leaving the hospital, which he can carry around and is recorded appropriately on the blockchain, then they can just give that attestation to the new hospital, and the hospital can just verify it from the blockchain, and you don't have this nightmare process. So it's a very different kind of a use case, and I wanted to bring that out, that it's not just about cryptocurrencies. It's about how do you use it in the day-to-day life, and how do you bring out value for individual consumers without actually making it a huge, big setup and stuff like that. So that's my 2 thoughts.
Shivani?
Yeah. Well, and let me first of all say that, I'm going to be talking here to represent my thoughts and views on the topic, not necessarily representing what we're doing as a company. SAP is doing a lot in this topic, and you've probably seen some announcements come out from us over the last week. But if you think about blockchain and you think about the technology and what it allows you to do, we see a lot of opportunities for applications. There are some that people are working on today, and then there's many more that we're starting to see come up and become possible. In my space specifically, I have a focus on supply chain and procurement. There's a number of use cases. I think one of the most common ones that is gaining a lot of visibility is around provenance. It's about how do you track and trace an item across the entire life cycle and through the supply chain. There's a company called Everledger that's done this with diamonds. So, starting with the diamonds coming out from the mine all the way through the entire process and where it lands up, they've put all that information on the blockchain that allows that to become a reality. I think many of you might remember, like sometimes in India, you hear these stories of, Johnny Walker bottles and people filling in fake alcohol in it and then selling it in the market, right? So this type of technology, people are looking at, when you talk about track and trace, it's looking at not only understanding where things are coming from, but also how do you maintain the authenticity of it so that you know that what you're getting is really that authentic product. Some of the scenarios that I've been hearing from people I talk to, for example, companies that are manufacturing potato chips, they want to be able to track right from the farm where the potato is coming from all the way to that chip that makes it into the packet that you're eating. Or, for example, auto manufacturers, and if they have parts like an airbag in their car, and being able to track where that came from, which supplier produced it, and then being able to, if there's any issue or if they have recalls, be able to go back to the source to take care of the problem. So track and trace and provenance is one that we're seeing a lot of interest in. There's things that we're seeing around transportation and logistics, and how do you optimize your freight container that's going on the ship, or how do you optimize and make sure that you're taking as much information, as much load on your truck as possible. So things like that we're seeing a lot of applications around. There's use cases around knowing your suppliers, knowing your customers. And then even in the HR space, your credentials from a bio perspective, how do you maintain that and how do you authenticate and validate? So many different use cases that I see emerging in the market with these technologies. Now, I will have to say that, when I started working in this space, I was a little skeptical about it. And today also I am cautiously optimistic, so I'm not going to say that it's a given and this is going to solve all the problems, but I think there is potential with this technology and we have to really go further and do more.
So from our perspective, it's a large area, there's a lot of buzz around it, so we have to look at it. I would say we haven't come across a lot of great enterprise use cases that make complete sense as to why it has to be done on blockchain. I think a lot of companies are talking about blockchain, but when you really dig in on why this is only possible because of blockchain, or why does blockchain provide you a distinct advantage over not doing it on blockchain. I don't think those answers have been crystal clear to us yet on the enterprise side. I think what we've begun to see is a lot of good teams have started coming out of really, talent hubs like Google, Facebook, and other places to attack this. I think on the public ledger side, there are more consumer use cases that have started coming up right now. Because if you think of it, blockchain is a public ledger, and very few enterprise use cases are completely public or open for information for sharing with everyone, right? And so on the private blockchain side, or maybe the enterprise use cases, I think supply chain is a great use case. I expect something there. I think shared loyalty points across a bunch of players who are dealing with the same audience might come up. I think fintech and payments might also, obviously payments applies to both consumer and enterprise use cases. I think on the consumer use cases, we are beginning to see all kinds of networks leverage tokens as an incentive mechanism for early rewarding the early users, as well as making sure that retention happens. So any network of users, if there's a token attached to it, and the token value actually grows with the strength of the network, then the early users get rewarded for being early into the network, and then there's a certain stickiness and referral activity that gets driven because of the token value increasing with the use of the actual product. I think sharing of information and files and things like the next gen Dropbox, or there are a lot of ideas around that kind of stuff, file sharing, music sharing, and other things. But again, more on the consumer side that we are seeing at least.
So, here's a simple example that I saw that I think made blockchain a little bit more real for me. There's a company that is providing what is called delayed flight insurance. You're traveling, and you want to get some insurance that if flight gets delayed by so many hours, you make some money out of it. So they basically provide an application where you go to their website, you sign up for, okay, I'm taking this flight, and if it's delayed by more than 2 hours, they'll tell you how much they'll pay and those kinds of things. Now they implemented that completely using a blockchain, so the information is all available. You don't need to file a claim. They basically get publicly available data on the flight arrival time. They use that to figure out how much the flight is delayed, if at all, and what you're due, and they basically pay you. So here's an example where something like this probably would have been very hard to do with the normal insurance claim process because the cost is very high. So there are a number of arguments that are given for why blockchains make sense. One is the reduced cost, one is the efficiency, you're eliminating a lot of the manual touch points, the multiple layers. And so those are some of the reasons why blockchain seems to make sense. There are a number of applications that people have talked about on the financial side. It's record keeping, taking care, basically managing commercial leases, insurance, and so on. So let me turn to the my panelists and have them address some questions. One of the questions is blockchain just the latest fad, or is there something about your application that makes blockchain really the right technology for implementing it? And since, Pramod, you have done some work with credentials, I think that'll be a good question to start with.
Sure. So first I'll say blockchain definitely has a big fad component to it right now, but at its core, it does have a lot of value. And it's a question of when will the value be appropriately utilized. The value that we see is really the immutability of the data. And if you think about the provenance use case that Shivani just talked about, theoretically you can do that with a central database sitting in the middle. But the question becomes, who do you trust to own that database? And that's where most of the use cases that you see are really about how do I make this data immutable so that there is a very clear audit trail around it. Coming back to the insurance thing that you just said, there's another company that we are talking to. What they're trying to do is micro-insurance for Uber rides or any kind of a ride-sharing thing. And there, one other property of blockchains come into the picture where blockchains give a loose notion of time. So they can specify when an event occurred before or after another event. And so with a blockchain, if you can record exactly when the passenger got into the car and when he got off and when an accident occurred, just that timing can allow an insurance company to reduce its risk associated with providing insurance for these 15-minute time frames. So it's really about looking at what is the core value of a blockchain, and most of it really comes from the immutability and the consensus around immutability. And that's where I think the value will come out over time. And most of these use cases keep going back to that part, that we don't trust a central authority to maintain the data, so we want to kind of distribute it among a whole bunch of people. And one thing we just have to be careful about when you do a public blockchain is you want to put data on it, but you don't want to put data in the clear. You just want to make sure that the blockchain can attest to the veracity of a piece of data, but it cannot actually leak the data itself. So those are some of the things people are working on. And over the next couple of years, you'll see real value coming out of that.
Yeah. I would agree with what Pramod just shared. And going back to your question, Sanjay, I do think blockchain is a hype. I mean, there's a lot of buzz around it. We're all seeing that. But like any technology that's surrounded by hype, I think it really comes down to the use cases and where are the application and where is the value you can deliver. And I think that as we look at blockchain and as we look at the use cases that are emerging, I haven't seen too many use cases today that are not something that people haven't talked about, right? Even supply chain track and trace, that's the holy grail of supply chain that people have been going after for many years. But I think that while the use cases are not completely different, there's things that have been in the way for making that possible today. And there's potential that blockchain offers to help overcome some of those limitations. And so there's 4 or 5 criteria that we look at when we think about, is an application good for blockchain? The first one is, are multiple parties involved? So are there many peoples and many players, not just a couple of players? The second is, does information need to cross trust boundaries, whether that's within a company or within organizations? The third is around the trust and transparency. So is there a need to have that information trustable, verifiable? And the fourth is around audit and history trail. So, is there a need for audit? Is there a need for verification? Is there a need for reporting? And then the fifth one, which is a little bit optional, is, are there intermediaries that can be removed from the process to make it more streamlined and efficient?
Nakul, you want to add anything to that?
I'd just say that I think there's hype and there's new applications emerging every time. Like 3 years ago, there was talk about how it can be used for micropayments. But I think some use cases have come up. For instance, I think use of a token as a funding mechanism for early stage startups is actually, like, people dismiss it because there's a lot more hype there. But it is a real way to actually avoid seed funding and quickly off to the races. And effectively, you're rewarding your users to fund. You're using your users, early users, to fund you, and then rewarding them for that early usage. So it's kind of, think of it as a next-gen Kickstarter in some ways. And that's a real use case, and that has already seen billions and billions of dollars go into it. Most of that will not result into something, but that doesn't mean it's not a real use case. And I think we're all waiting for a more solid and concrete use case around information sharing, and but funding itself can be a use case if nothing else, I think.
Sort of shifting a little bit, there has been a lot of interest in a public, open source blockchain called Ethereum that came, I think it was founded by some guys from Google, and a lot of people are building on top of that. So my next question to the panelist is, are you building your own blockchain, or are you sort of comfortable building on open source blockchain like Ethereum? Start with
so we are actually building our own blockchain, but based on the Ethereum code base, because we are looking at, for all the use cases we're looking at, it's all about identity. And Ethereum has this whole notion of a virtual machine, and you can do it with Ethereum, but it can become very expensive. So we are kind of building some of those into a core feature set in the blockchain to make things easier and flow easier. But yeah, you can do it on existing blockchains or new ones. The question really becomes, when do you need to, if you want to create a new blockchain, do you have the technical know how to do that? And B, our biggest problem is how do we get the appropriate set of miners to maintain the blockchain? And how do you make sure that it doesn't get taken over by any of the big mining pools out there? And I don't know if you guys know this, but from a smart contract perspective, right now there are only about 4 or 5 public blockchains running, out of which, other than Ethereum, none of them have more than 15 or 20 miners today. So it's really like Neo, the next biggest one, has 13 miners, and one of their nodes went down and it just kind of shut down. Creating mining power is one of the big questions, and how do you make sure that how you don't have guys from North Korea mining on it, and you might end up with legal hassles because you end up actually paying North Koreans. So there are some hassles around those kinds of things that we are looking into. And we are trying to create something where you have credentialed miners, and so you know exactly who the miners are. And so because of some of those conditions, we are looking at creating our own blockchain, but otherwise using Ethereum sounds just good.
Giovanni?
Yeah, we're not building our own blockchain. So we are working with open source and other blockchain technologies. What we are looking at is an abstraction layer that allows us to create services that make it easier for our ecosystem and our teams to plug into these existing blockchains. And we're also, so for us, and again, coming back to what I look at, it's much more around the application side. I want to focus on the application and the use case, not necessarily building out the platform capabilities itself, and leave that to the experts so that they invest where they have their best resources. I invest where I have my best knowledge. And so, for me, it's really about leveraging other technologies that are there, but focusing on the abstraction layer that allows me to build the applications and also, quite honestly, interconnect between different environments if needed.
Yeah, I think at the application layer, it makes sense to leverage other people's infrastructure and mining capacity and all of that. I think if you're trying to build the next gen, I don't know, Uber or some kind of a distributed, like peer-to-peer network, you have enough problems of your own to focus on from a growth and engagement perspective than the infrastructure layer, and you'd be better off building it on top of Ethereum or something.
So the challenge that I think people face when they're going with open source blockchains like Ethereum is that Ethereum runs primarily on what they call the proof of work protocol, and it's about a 10-minute deal. It takes 10 minutes to sort of sync up for a transaction. Now, if you start looking at high volume transactions like credit cards or insurance, that's not going to be good enough. So at that point, people talk about going to maybe a proof of stake kind of protocol, which is still unproven. So my question is, if you guys have anything, because since you're actually actively out there trying to build some application, any perspective on those kinds of challenges?
I think the expectation is that will change, and if that won't change, then Ethereum will be replaced by somebody else who will bring that. Ultimately, 10 minutes is too slow, then it just becomes a fad. And then 5 years later, we'll say it was a fun thing, but nothing came out of it, right?
Yeah, I mean, the way we look at it, there's a bunch of them, EOS and others coming out with faster networks. Yeah. Even Ethereum has something called Plasma, which is supposed to come out and increase the speed. But just one perspective on speed of transactions. So people keep talking about Visa doing 30,000 or 40,000 transactions per second. But look at it from a different perspective. If I'm a merchant and I get payment in Visa, I actually get the money 30 days later. But if I get the money on Ethereum, I get it 10 minutes later, which is the faster one, right? So it's all about perspective on how do you look at what is the time frame. But I do agree that the volume numbers right now are very low, and that is going to change very soon because there's work on how to combine proof of work and proof of stake together to speed up the process and the sharding, all kinds of things happening. So in a year's time, you'll see much higher volumes. It's probably not going to reach the Visa volume very soon, but I think just looking at the use cases, you might find that it's actually more valuable to use a blockchain than to use a centralized system like Visa.
And I think those limitations, because there are some limitations with blockchain, right? And I think this is one of the big ones. And quite honestly, that also helps you decide, one, what is the use case in the application? But second, what is the type of information that you put on the blockchain versus, or what are the scenarios where you may complement other systems that are existing, right? Like, for example, one question I get very often is blockchain going to eliminate the need for a network? But there's certain strengths that a network brings in terms of in terms of history, in terms of information, in terms of relationships that exist. So these technologies actually complement each other rather than one replacing the other. And over time, as we go forward and some of the limitations get, people work on removing some of these limitations, who knows what else is possible?
So, one of the major arguments for blockchain is that you can do smart contracts, which means that your contract terms are actually in software that can be automated, they'll run fast, and they'll be efficient and all those things. And yet, we all know that software is buggy. I mean, no one has really figured out a way to make software really bug-free. And a good example is there's a cryptocurrency platform called DAO that was built on top of Ethereum. And someone figured out a way to hack it. So DAO raised a whole bunch of millions of dollars, and this hacker figured out a way to basically siphon 50 million of that into his account. And the way to fix that is that the Ethereum community basically did a hard fork on the software, and in that hard fork, they basically retrieved the money back. So now the question is, you have one problem, which is fraud happening, and you have a second problem where the community decided to band together and do a hard fork, which in some sense is breaking the trust boundary. So the solution may actually turn out to be even worse in some ways. It's like the federal government saying, okay, you don't owe all that money, I'm going to take that money back from you because you got that somehow from some unethical means or something. So the question is, how do we create that kind of a trust? Because if you look at banks, after 1929, there was a run on the banks, and the only way you could guarantee it, not because they have a big building, because the federal government stepped in and said, okay, we'll do FDIC, FSLIC, and stuff like that. What will it take for people to start trusting blockchain that you could say, okay, I'm going to put my 401k in there, or I'm going to rely on it for doing Medicare claims, or any of those kinds of things? Anyone want?
Okay. So we are looking at that, and I've written software for 25 years, and I completely agree that I don't think anyone can write completely bug-free software. So that's why we kind of are moving around the problem instead of facing up to it, and looking at the use cases of immutable data rather than smart contract-based stuff. Because if you look at just the immutable data sitting on a blockchain, you don't need to trust any piece of code for it. And what you're really saying is that I'm trusting the blockchain just to store information for me. Maybe at some point we will have a better way of dealing with smart contracts and actually trusting that code. But till that point comes, I think there is still a lot of value in blockchains which can be achieved without trusting a piece of code. And that's where we are looking at it.
I mean, so there's a couple of things. One is blockchain will not be applicable to everything. So if there's a heavily complicated contract, that shouldn't go on a smart contract. Smart contract at the very basic is in a if-then-else statement. And so let's keep simple contracts. The second point is all contracts are buggy. All rules are buggy. You create regulations, then you change them. Anybody here who has a legal contract is a 30-page, 60-page document. None of us know after we sign that document as to what's gone into it, right? And there are lots of loopholes there also. So those things might never go on the smart contract because that's where the entire legal industry exists, that when it comes, they'll fight amongst each other on figuring out what is the exact if-then-else and the nested loop there. So the simplest contracts will start first. The second is, I think even in the financial system today, we've all had credit cards that get hacked, and then the banks have created a system where they can check fraud early. You instantly get your card blocked. They call you. They ask you, is this transaction yours or not? And I think there will be an entire layer of fraud detection things on top of the blockchain systems that will come up. So I think that entire ecosystem is yet to be built. And there will continue to be fraud, like what happened with DAO. But the question is, should it be caught when the first $5 fraud happens, or the 50 million fraud? In that case, it was caught too late, and so they had to do the hard fork. But if it was caught too early and the correction happens at a very small level, would you call it a hard fork? Would it be as problematic? Because already that is happening in our current financial system where they are reversing transactions.
Yeah, I would agree. And I do think that, like you said, software is buggy and you evolve from there. And, it's really about understanding. And to your point, it's about not everything needs to go on the blockchain. Not everything needs to be run by smart contracts, right? So what are the things that are okay to do it, put on the smart contract? What is something you maintain separately and do it differently? The other thing I think is, as you think about smart contracts in the blockchain, the more it's open, there are more eyes on it that can help understand where the bugs are and be able to solve that. And then it comes down to what is the governance model that's in place to help resolve, when there's an issue with a smart contract, how do you fix it? So those are some of the things that I think people need to work through and think through, especially around the governance model in these open blockchain, public blockchain environments.
So before we turn it over to the audience, let me just ask my last question to the panel. There is a lot of debate about public versus private or public versus permission network. So maybe you guys can address where you see a role for one or the other.
I think you had a very good point of view on that.
So I like that distinction you made, Sanjay. I tend to think of it more as public versus permissioned, because private to me, is something very private and within one company. I think in general, if you think about blockchain, the technology and the value it adds, the public blockchains is where we want to be, where everyone wants to strive towards. But today, there are some issues and limitations with going there, right? And that's why you're seeing a lot of these permissioned blockchains come up and these permissioned environments. One is if you put everything on a public blockchain, just the complexity and the cost and the speed is an issue. We touched upon that earlier, right? So that's one big factor that's limiting and why people are doing more permission-based. The second is a little bit around psychological mindset as well, where people hear the word public, and especially large enterprises will say, I don't want my sensitive corporate enterprise information in a public environment, right? I somewhat compare this to cloud, where 20 years ago, if you talked to a company about putting their HR data on a cloud, they would have thrown up all over it and said, no way. But now, if you look at most of the enterprise applications, they are cloud-based, and people are comfortable putting their information on the cloud. But it's really important how you maintain the data, right? So, to the point that Pramod was making earlier, you have the chains available publicly, but you secure the information and the data so that only the right people can get access and see it. So that's the second thing so I think there's a lot of psychological aspect that needs to be overcome as well. But, in general, so we are seeing both public and permission blockchains coming up. But, as we evolve, the ideal would be that everything is a public.
Well, thank you. And I think the time has come to have the audience ask a few questions. So if you'll come to the...
That's okay, sorry.
And just quickly state your name, your IT, and ask the question. Yeah, and I'm looking at the time.
Hi, my name is Sudhanshu Bahadur, IIT Kanpur. So my question is more towards Shivani. On the track and trace side, the weakest link seems to be authenticity. How do you, for example, Everledger how does one address that? Especially in
Yeah.
like chemical.
Yeah, great. Hi, Sudhanshu. Great to see you. So, great question. And, this is, I see, that's why I keep saying that, I'm cautiously optimistic about this space, because I don't think it's a slam dunk yet where it's solving all the problems. To your question, actually, as you think about authenticity and you think about that track and trace, one is that you need all the players to get involved in that ecosystem, right? You can't do it with just one or two players. Right. So to me, that's a big limitation today in terms of how do you get all the right people involved. The second is the authenticity or the validity of the claim, and this is where I think there's actually some value that blockchain brings, because you have a lot of eyes to it that can help you ensure that you're being able to track the information in the right way, and that people are not putting something out there that's incorrect or wrong.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Sulabh from IIT Delhi. So assume a scenario where an enterprise has a use case which only blockchain can resolve. So what's the biggest challenge a such enterprise can fail to leverage the technologies of a blockchain?
I'm sorry, can you repeat your question? I didn't.
Yeah, so assume a scenario where an enterprise have a use case that only a blockchain can resolve, blockchain technologies can resolve.
Yeah.
So for such enterprises, right, especially for a conglomerate, what's the biggest challenge they have to overcome so that they can start using blockchain technologies?
Well, so maybe I'm going to answer your question in a slightly different way. I will say almost all large companies today are looking at blockchain and how can they adopt it and bring it into their environments. Like every customer I talk to has blockchain on their mind and is interested in it. I think everyone's looking today at how do you improve current process, or rather I shouldn't say everyone, but a lot of people today are looking at how do you improve what's happening today and do it differently. So it's, there's net new things that are possible, yes, but I think a lot of people are on this journey of learning blockchain and what can you do with it. And so the steps that I'm seeing people take are more around, how do we take current processes and think about doing them different, whether it's cross-border trade, whether it's any number of different use cases. So for them, it's less about, what is this net new that I'm trying to do, but more around how do I do things differently. And over time, the next stage I see, once they figure out what is this technology, they're going to start thinking about, okay, now, these are the possibilities that it opens up for me to apply it.
Okay, thank you.
Next.
Shyam from IIT Kanpur 91. Question is for Pramod related to the use case you talked about, the inefficiency when a physician joins a hospital. That's the B2B. A more generic, similar use cases, let's say when you move to a new area, who's the right physician to go to? Can you trust their public Yelp equivalent? Yes. Or selling homes where title search has to be done. It takes 30 days to buy whether a $50,000 home or a $5 million home. So there are inefficiencies already in B2B as well as B2C. So what's preventing the blockchain to kind of become the norm where inefficiencies are inherent and in real estate scenario there is money to fund that because you spend 5-6% in the transaction because of the inefficiency of the system today.
And what you said is absolutely true. There are lots of inefficiencies, and I was just describing one small part of it. This is really a subset of attestation use cases, and you can club all kinds of things. So one of the other things we are working on is an attestation use case where a broker can be given permission to sign the lease on behalf of a landlord. Right? But all of these things are really fundamentally, it comes back down to identity on the blockchain. So the core issue that people need to solve is, if I see an attestation saying, okay, this is true, how do I trust that the guy who gave the attestation is actually valid and who's not a phantom user? Which is really what your problem is when you come to reviews. Like, you don't know if the reviews were just made up by someone or they're actually true reviews. So once we get true identity, digital identity on the blockchain for people, all of these use cases can be addressed very quickly. But that's where everybody is kind of moving around, trying to figure out how to get identity on the blockchain without compromising the personal information.
So we have time for one last question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm the lucky one, right? Thank you. So I am Tushar from ITBHU, and I have a very specific question for Shivani. Enterprise use cases, where do you see a very good intersection of artificial intelligence and blockchain? If I remember correctly, you manage both the teams. Not SAP views, your view in general.
Yeah, great question, Tushar. So, I mean, and I'm also looking at the clock here, but as you think about these technologies, I think there's a lot of intersection and value that you can bring together. If you think about blockchain, there's so much data that you're housing, there's so much information and content. You think about AI, it can help you bring external information, content, and also understand the information that's in your blockchain and be able to leverage that, right? So, short answer to your question, I think there's a lot of opportunities for the intersection of these technologies to be able to deliver value, and then we can always talk offline about more detail.
Thank you.
I want to thank the panelists for very good